Hi, my name is Lena March. I was thrown out of my own house because of a secret. 8 years later, they came back not to apologize, but to ask for my signature. It didn't happen in a thunderstorm the way novels pretend. It was quieter. A Tuesday evening, the hallway lit by the yellow glow of a chandelier that had always seemed too ornate for the dust it collected. Victor, my father, didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words were clipped, rehearsed the way he delivered speeches in front of donors and cameras. He said I was making things difficult. He said the family couldn't withstand another scandal. And then the front door closed with a deliberate click that sounded more final than any courtroom gavel. For years, I carried the silence like a second skin. I worked. I studied. I tried to rebuild a discipline that had once aimed toward law school. But there are scars you don't talk about, scars that whisper every time you sign your own name, wondering if it still belongs to you. 8 years later, on an unremarkable morning, my phone lit up with a message from Corbett, the family's attorney. His words were diplomatic, but the implication was sharp. Your presence is required to complete certain documents regarding the estate of Ruth March, my grandmother Ruth, the only one who had ever slipped me envelopes with careful notes and pressed $20 bills whispering, "Keep your own account. Never let them write your story for you." She had left me a trust quiet and deliberate, tucked into legal language they hadn't been able to erase. That was why they wanted me back. Not because I was Lena, daughter, sister, human being, but because my name still occupied a line they couldn't cross without ink. A close-up of the birth certificate I had found years ago, the one that set everything in motion. The rectangle of thin paper, its edges curled, the ink faded. And there it was, Father. An empty space, an absence notarized with a faint seal that looked more like a bruise than authority. That blank line was my crime. Not because I had written it, but because I had read it. Because I had carried it to my mother Helena and asked the question her silence refused to answer. Because I had dared to hold evidence in a family that worshipped image above truth. Bianca, my sister, had always been the face of us, the smile on glossy brochures, the rehearsed warmth in televised interviews. She had been groomed for it. I had been groomed for silence. But silence cracks when you stumble across the wrong file in the wrong drawer. And Theo, my first love, the one who held my hand when I trembled with the weight of what I'd found, was quietly bought off. Disappeared just like I had been. Now they were back lining up their signatures like soldiers waiting for mine to fall in place. They didn't expect me to remember. They didn't expect me to keep copies, to have learned the discipline of evidence from Judge Miriam Klein, my mentor, who taught me that the law isn't about who shouts the loudest, but who documents the quietest. So when they slid the papers across the table, estate transfers, authorizations, agreements, I didn't reach for the pen. I reached for the memory of that blank line. I let the silence stretch. Let Victor's smile strain, let Bianca's polished composure flicker under fluorescent light. Because a signature is not forgiveness. Ink is not reconciliation. And no one erases me without my consent. Have you ever uncovered a single document that changed the course of your family? Comment 1 if yes, 0 if not. Shin Chao Toi Ten La Lena March. The house always smelled like performance. Not roses, not perfume performance. That afternoon it was lemon polish, clinging to the banister, sharp and artificial, mingling with the accidental bitterness of burnt bread left too long in the toaster. Together, they created a stage set of domesticity, the illusion of order. If you closed your eyes, you could almost forget the walls carried echoes of silence rather than laughter. My mother, Helena, believed in silence as strategy. She never argued, never admitted, never confessed. She simply polished the furniture until it gleamed and stacked lists of names for whatever gala was next. That day, she called me into the dining room, her voice steady as if nothing had ever fractured in our lives. "Lena, can you help me organize the files for tomorrow night? Not will you not, do you want to? Can you—" A question that was really an instruction. On the long mahogany table, long enough to seat 20, though only 4 of us had ever eaten there, she had spread manila folders, each labeled in Bianca's looping, photogenic handwriting. Guest lists, donation pledges, seating charts. The usual choreography of image. My sister's name appeared again and again, circled, highlighted, printed on glossy program drafts, as if she were both hostess and legacy. I sat down because my body still remembered how to obey. The chair was cold against my legs, and when I opened the first folder, the smell of ink and paper rose up like something alive. Gala planning was ritual in our house. The March name survived not on honesty, but on appearances the way candlelight softens even the harshest corners. I shuffled through the papers, aligning them into neat stacks. Discipline, after all, was muscle memory for me. But beneath the orderly lines, I saw the chaos of omission. Names, missing notes, scrawled in shorthand, one guest's pledge recorded twice. The kind of sloppiness my father would never allow in a courtroom, but excused when it protected the family's veneer. The burnt bread smell drifted in again, carried from the kitchen where no one had bothered to throw it out. It clung to the lemon polish, a reminder that perfection always carried scorch marks if you leaned close enough. Bianca swept in midway through radiant, even in jeans, her hair catching the late sunlight like it had been rehearsed. She kissed our mother's cheek, ignored me entirely, and picked up a draft of the seating chart. Victor wants the donors closest to the stage, she said, as though she were the one making executive decisions. And put journalist Shah in the back. Far back. I didn't look up, but my stomach tightened at the name. Priya Shah. Independent sharp, known for asking the questions no one else dared. I had read her articles while working late nights with Judge Klein. Priya was the kind of reporter who saw through polish. Far back, Bianca repeated, sliding the chart toward me as if I were the secretary. My mother didn't contradict her. She never did. She simply nodded fingers, brushing an invisible smear of dust from the table's edge. And me, I kept stacking papers. I told myself it didn't matter that this was just a task, that the lemon and bread air didn't mean anything. But every page I touched reminded me of Ruth, my grandmother, who had once pressed my hand against a ledger and whispered, "Always keep your own copy." Lena, so I did. Quietly, carefully, I slipped the duplicate sheets into a folder of my own. Evidence doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits in the margins in seating charts and donation ledgers and the contradictions between what a family says and what it documents. When I finally pushed back from the table, the air seemed heavier. The lemon sharpness had dulled the bread bitterness stronger. The house looked the same, but I knew better. This was no home. This was a stage, and tomorrow night the curtain would rise again. And I, whether they acknowledged me or not, would be standing in the wings, holding the files they thought I had forgotten. The first thing I remember is the sound, not the words, not even the paper itself, but the sharp scrape of wood against wood when I pulled at my father's desk drawer. It was the one in his study that never opened cleanly, always catching on something deep inside. That night, I tugged harder than usual, and the whole desk shuddered. A thin film of dust rose from the leather blotter on top, curling in the lamplight like smoke. The drawer finally gave way, groaning like it had been keeping secrets too long. Inside were the usual artifacts of Victor March's performance, polished fountain pens, embossed stationery newspaper clippings, in which his name appeared in bold. But beneath them, tucked so far back I had to wedge my hand into the corner, was a manila envelope, its flap worn soft, its edges frayed as if it had been handled often, then hidden again. I should have left it alone. That's what the voice in my head whispered, even as my fingers pulled it free. But I didn't. I slid the papers out and saw it a birth certificate. My birth certificate. The page had yellowed with time, the ink slightly bled. In the space where the form demanded father's name, there was nothing. A blank line. An emptiness more damning than any falsehood. And at the bottom, the notary seal blurred, but intact declared the document valid. Someone had signed, someone had stamped, and still the line where Victor's name should have been was left untouched. I stared at that line so long I felt dizzy. In a house where image was oxygen, this was suffocating proof. All the rehearsed speeches, all the smiling photographs Bianca staged, all my mother's lemon-polished silences, none of it could overwrite a void printed in black ink. I didn't hear him walk in. My father's presence filled the room before his voice did. He stopped in the doorway, watching me with the stillness of a predator. "What are you doing?" he asked, though the flatness of his tone suggested he already knew. My hand shook, but I held the paper up anyway. "Why is it blank?" My voice cracked on the last word, but I didn't care. Why doesn't it say your name for a moment? Victor March, pillar of reputation man who charmed donors with practiced ease, looked small. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked to the certificate, then away. The silence between us stretched until it was unbearable. Then he said it. Get out of this house. Not shouted. Not argued. Just delivered like a verdict. As if the evidence in my hand was a crime and the sentence was exile. I opened my mouth, ready to plead, to demand, to insist on the truth. But the words dissolved. My mother's footsteps sounded faintly in the hallway, then retreated, never entering. Helena's silence had always been her weapon. She wielded it again now. The certificate trembled in my grasp. Proof, and yet useless in that moment. I wanted to burn it, to tear it, to press it into my skin until it branded me with the reality they had forced me to carry. But instead, I folded it carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and tucked it beneath my coat. When I stepped past him, his shoulder brushed mine. Cold, immovable, final. He didn't stop me. Didn't call me back. He just let the door close behind me with the same decisive click I would later hear in every courtroom I worked in with Judge Klein. That was the night silence ended for me. Not because anyone spoke, but because a blank line on an official form spoke louder than any family ever had. Evidence doesn't lie. It just waits patient, merciless for the moment someone dares to read it. The night I left didn't feel cinematic. There were no suitcases tossed into the rain, no neon signs humming above my head like in the movies I used to watch when I still believed stories bent toward justice. There was only a laundromat at the far edge of town, its parking lot cracked with weeds, its windows fogged from machines that never stopped turning. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed with a kind of tired electricity, casting everything in a gray-blue wash that made skin look bruised, air look stale, and hope feel faint. I counted once, twice. Then a third time, $28. Crumpled bills folded twice, smoothed against my thigh like I could iron out my future along with the creases. I kept them in my pocket as if pressing them flat would make them multiply. Beside the money sat an old bus card with just enough balance for maybe 2 more rides if the machine didn't spit it back out with its usual error beep. That was my fortune. My empire, a kingdom of paper bills and declining plastic. The laundromat was nearly empty. A man in a heavy jacket slept sitting upright against the tiled wall, his chin tucked to his chest, his whole body bent into the shape of defeat. A woman folded towels with military precision earbuds, sealing her inside a private world where no one could touch her. Each movement of her hands was clipped sharp like she was folding not fabric, but memory. The air smelled like detergent that had given up halfway sweet at first, then sharp, then sour under the weight of wet cotton left too long in the spin. I picked a cracked plastic chair, the kind that gave a small groan every time you shifted, as though reminding you it had outlived its usefulness. My bag sat at my feet, looking far too small to contain a life. Inside, 2 notebooks, a toothbrush, 1 spare shirt, and the envelope. The envelope that carried my original birth certificate. The proof, the evidence, the blank space where my father's name should have been. I touched it through the canvas fabric like it might pulse back. Evidence, I kept reminding myself. Evidence that mattered even if no one wanted to see it. That was when the phone buzzed. A single vibration against my thigh, small but violent in its timing. For the briefest second, a reckless kind of hope lit in me. Irrational. Dangerous. Maybe it was my mother. Maybe Bianca, her voice thinner without the stage asking if I was safe. Maybe some invisible crack in their silence had opened at last. My hand trembled as I pulled the phone from my pocket. 1 message. From my father's number. We do not have a child like you. The words were so neat, so polished, typed with the same clipped efficiency he used for press statements and donor thank yous. No anger, no curse words, just finality. Cold, clinical finality. As though I had been deleted not just from the house, not just from the trust of family, but from existence itself. The phone screen went dark in my hand. Room tone. 1 second. The hum of the fluorescent light filled the silence. The faint rattle of a dryer bled into the background, the emptiness of a world that had just shut me out pressed against my chest. I stared at the black glass until my own reflection blurred into a smear, like even my face refused to belong. My throat was dry, but no tears came. Crying felt like a language they had taught me something they could own if I gave in. Tears would be evidence too, but evidence of weakness. Instead, I sat very still, my breath shallow, my heart tapping an uneven rhythm that barely kept me upright. The dryers churned on their mechanical mouths, chewing up socks and shirts, the fabric slamming against steel drums like bones rattling. Each turn sounded like time grinding forward without me. I pressed the phone against my chest the way someone presses a wound. Even with the screen dark, the words still burned inside my ribs. Not a child. Not theirs. Not anything. The $28 wouldn't last long. I knew that with the cold precision Judge Klein would later drill into me. The bus card would run out. The cracked chair would never be home. And yet for that suspended second before I stood up, before I began the impossible task of building out of ashes, I let myself feel it fully, the freefall. Because falling, I realized, wasn't the same as ending. Falling meant motion. It meant gravity hadn't claimed me completely. It meant there was still a chance to land somewhere unexpected. A dryer beeped in the corner, a shrill reminder that someone's cycle had finished. The woman with the earbuds didn't move. The man in the jacket kept sleeping, his breath fogging in tiny bursts. The world kept spinning indifferently. And me, forgotten daughter, unwanted evidence bearer of a blank line on a legal document. I folded the message back into silence, stood up from the creaking chair, and stepped outside into the night. The air was cold, the sky low, but for the first time the darkness didn't just belong to them. It belonged to me. The night after the laundromat, I did something reckless. I dialed Theo. It wasn't habit by then, we hadn't spoken in months, but grief has a way of resurrecting ghosts. The payphone outside the bus station smelled like copper and mildew, the receiver sticky against my cheek. I fed it 2 quarters, listened to the hollow ring. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound stretched like a rope I was desperate to climb. Then he answered. His voice, once familiar as breath, now came wrapped in distance. Lena, I can't talk long. I tried to swallow the sharp edge in my throat. Where are you, far? He said. Just that word. No city, no details. Far. Did they? I began but stopped. I already knew. Silence thickened on the line. In the background, I thought I heard traffic, maybe an airport announcement, maybe nothing but the echo of my own desperation. I'm going away for a while. Theo said finally, his tone rehearsed. It's better this way. Better. For whom? For Victor. For Bianca's carefully curated image, for the March family machine that chewed up anyone inconvenient I wanted to argue, to demand honesty, to remind him of every late night in the library when we whispered futures into each other's ears, futures that smelled like coffee and possibility. But the quarters ticked down, and my discipline, the same muscle that had always kept me upright, froze my tongue. So I said nothing. He breathed once, twice. Then the line went dead. The silence that followed wasn't just absence. It was disconnection made flesh, the kind of silence you couldn't break, no matter how many times you redialed. I pressed the receiver to my ear long after the dial tone buzzed, holding on as if my grip could keep him tethered. Eventually, the machine spat my last quarter back into the tray like even money didn't want to be wasted on me. Days passed. I buried myself in bus rides and temp jobs in the mechanical rhythm of survival. I told myself not to think of him, but the human mind is cruel. It circles back to the wound until you recognize its shape. Then came the email. It wasn't even sent to me directly. It arrived by accident, a reply-all chain from Corbett's office, his paralegal clumsy with the CC field. I opened it on a borrowed library computer, my pulse quickening as the subject line loaded March Estate Discretionary Disbursement. Scrolling, I saw it plain as ink. A wire transfer. A neat figure that would have seemed enormous to me, enough to erase debt, enough to vanish on, enough to buy silence. And in the memo line, to Theo Raines, for relocation assistance. Relocation assistance. That was what they called exile. That was what they paid him for. I sat frozen, the glow of the screen burning my eyes while the library's air conditioner hummed above me. In that instant, every unanswered call, every half sentence, every strained smile Theo had given me fell into place like puzzle pieces I wished I'd never solved. He hadn't chosen to leave me. He'd been bought. Bought and shipped out like defective merchandise, just another loose thread clipped to keep the March tapestry flawless. And yet the truth cut deeper, he had taken the money. I logged out, hands trembling on the sticky keyboard, the cursor blinking like an accusation. Outside the world, continued cars idled at red lights. Teenagers laughed on the library steps, but my chest felt hollow, scraped clean. It wasn't betrayal in the cinematic sense. There were no slammed doors, no shouted confessions, just the cold elegance of a transaction buried in a CC list. A wire transfer in black and white. A love story reduced to a line item. That night, I folded the printout into the same envelope that carried my birth certificate. Evidence. The file grew thicker, heavier, as if the truth itself had mass. I kept it close even as it scorched me from the inside. Because now I understood they didn't just erase me. They erased anyone who dared to stand near me. And the currency they used wasn't just silence, it was money. Clean, undeniable, traceable money. Evidence doesn't lie. Not in ink, not in numbers, not in the shadow of a CC field. There is a certain defiance in buying something cheap. I learned that the week after the email about Theo. My money was running thin, $18 total, folded and refolded in my pocket until the paper felt soft as cloth. Every purchase had to be weighed like evidence bread versus bus fare, soap versus shelter. But one afternoon, I wandered into a drugstore, the kind with fluorescent tubes that hummed too loudly, the smell of bleach clashing with bubblegum from the candy aisle. I didn't go in with a plan. My body simply drifted toward the stationery section as if memory knew before I did. The shelves were crowded with spiral-bound notebooks, most of them flimsy, their covers curling at the edges from humidity. Plastic spines bent cardboard, torn thin paper waiting to fall apart. But on the bottom row, half hidden, I found one. Plain black cover, cardboard stiff enough that it resisted bending. The price tag read $5 in red ink. I should have walked away. $5 meant 2 days of food if I stretched it. But I couldn't. I picked it up, held it in my hand, and felt something click inside me. It was weightless but heavy with promise. The cashier didn't notice anything unusual. To her, I was just another girl buying a notebook. To me, it was a transaction with myself, an oath disguised as stationery. That night, back in the borrowed room, a couch in a stranger's apartment, its springs groaning every time I turned, I set the notebook on my lap. The first page was blank, its faint blue lines waiting. My pen was a cheap ballpoint I'd swiped from a bank counter, ink already threatening to run dry. My hand shook as I pressed it down, but I didn't stop. Lena March, all caps, heavy strokes. The ink bled slightly, leaving shadows on the next page, but I pressed harder, almost carving the paper. For a moment, I just stared at it. My name. My name, not his. Not theirs. I whispered it out loud. Lena March. The syllables sounded fragile, like they might crack in the air, but also immovable like stone underwater. Then I wrote it again. And again. Line after line, the way school children are forced to copy sentences for punishment. Each repetition steadied my breathing. Each smear of ink across the page was both a wound and a bandage. By the 10th line, my fingers were smudged gray-blue. By the 20th, my hand cramped. But I kept going until the entire page was nothing but me. It was absurd, $5 for a notebook ink borrowed from a bank pen, my body hunched on a couch that wasn't mine. And yet, for the first time in weeks, I felt like I existed. The March name had always been a brand, polished by Victor, a stage Bianca performed on a silence Helena guarded like scripture. But this version was mine, unedited, uncropped. I flipped to the second page and wrote a vow across the top: no erasures, no whiteout, no revisions by other hands. It was childish in its simplicity, but it burned like a contract. I pressed the pen so hard the words left dents in the paper behind them. If nothing else, I would keep this promise to myself. The notebook became my shield. I slid it under my pillow that night like a talisman, the thin cardboard edge pressing into my temple. And in the morning, when the bus jolted me awake on the way to a temp job, I pulled it out again, tracing the letters with my finger as if they could keep me from unraveling. I didn't know yet what it would grow into. I didn't know Judge Miriam Klein would one day read my notes and call them a spine in ink. I didn't know Priya Shah years later would run her thumb across these very pages, recognizing that sometimes the smallest artifacts carry the loudest truths. All I knew in that moment was that I had written my name. And for the first time since the jammed drawer, since the laundromat, since Theo's silence and the wire transfer that erased him, I felt like the pen was in my hand, not theirs. $5, 26 sheets of paper, a vow no one could edit. It wasn't much. But for me, it was enough to begin again. The ad was small, almost invisible. Wedged between listings for dog walkers and house cleaners, it read, "Retired judge seeks live-in aid. Organizational skills required. Room and board provided." I stared at it for a long time, the letters blurring on the library's bulletin board. I had $18 left in my notebook and a bus card with one ride left if the scanner didn't reject it. A live-in position wasn't just work, it was survival. The house was nothing like the March estate. No chandeliers, no polished banisters dripping with lemon scent, no walls dressed for performance. Judge Miriam Klein's place sat on the corner of a quiet street. Its brick facade chipped its windows plain. Inside, there were no framed family portraits, no curated art. The rooms were stripped to function, tall shelves crammed with case books, binders stacked in precarious towers, boxes labeled with years and jurisdictions. The only decoration was the order of law itself. I met her in the study. She was small but carried herself like the gavel had never left her hand. Silver hair pulled tight, glasses, perched low eyes sharp as if they had never missed a detail in their lives. "You're Lena," she said. Not a question. Her voice was firm but not unkind. Yes, I managed. My fingers itched at the strap of my bag. I half expected her to ask for references for transcripts for some piece of paper proving I was worth the position. But she didn't. She just studied me, head tilted slightly, the way judges look at defendants before passing sentence. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then she spoke. People only start to matter when someone tries to erase them. The words struck deeper than she could have known. Or maybe she did know. Maybe she read it on my face, the way I flinched, the way my throat closed around air. I nodded, but my voice caught when I answered. "I know something about that." Her gaze didn't soften, but it steadied me. "Good. Then you understand why precision matters. Why nothing gets thrown away. Why ink and records are stronger than speeches." She gestured toward a stack of files on the table. Each one bore a case name, some familiar from law journals I'd once devoured when I still dreamed of law school. She pushed them toward me. "You'll start by sorting these," she said. "Chronological order. No missing dates. No skipped pages. A case without its record is nothing but gossip. You understand?" Yes. The word came out firmer than I expected. And just like that, the job was mine. That first night, I unpacked my few belongings into a spare room with a narrow bed and a single desk. No curtains, no decorations, just space and silence. But it was mine. The notebook slid into the drawer, my name scrawled across its pages like a shield. For the first time in months, I slept without the sound of laundromat dryers in the background. In the days that followed, Miriam tested me without ceremony. She left gaps in her instructions to see if I would notice scattered duplicate documents to check if I would catch them. She never praised me, never smiled when I succeeded. But every evening when she found the files precisely aligned, her silence felt less like absence and more like acknowledgement. I began to understand her house wasn't empty, it was deliberate. She had stripped it of distractions so the evidence could breathe so nothing clouded the record. Living there was like living inside an archive, and for me it felt almost like safety. One night as I carried a box of depositions into the study, I asked her why she hired me. She didn't look up from her reading. "Because you showed up," she said simply. Then after a pause, "And because someone tried to erase you. That means you'll fight harder to make sure the record stays." Her words settled into me like ink on paper, permanent and undeniable. I realized then that maybe the March family had thrown me out, but in doing so, they had made me legible to someone who lived by a different creed. That erasure is the proof of importance, and the only answer to it is documentation. That was how I became Judge Miriam Klein's aide. That was how the girl with $28, a bus card, and a blank line on her birth certificate began to rebuild herself not as a ghost, but as a record that could not be scrubbed away. Judge Klein believed in order, so I learned to live inside boxes. Not metaphorical ones. Actual boxes. Heavy cardboard cartons lined her study, each labeled in her tight judicial handwriting. Depositions, 1994 motions, 2001 settlement, 2008. The system was rigid but comforting. Nothing misplaced, nothing forgotten. One evening, as I sorted through a stack destined for storage, she pushed a dented tin box across the desk toward me. Found this mixed in with an old estate file, she said, her tone neutral. Might be of interest to you. My pulse skipped. The box wasn't hers, it was mine. At least it had been once. I recognized the pattern stamped into the lid, roses faded almost to gray edges, rusted where someone's thumb had worried the metal. I had seen it years ago, tucked on the top shelf of Ruth March's closet. My grandmother's closet. With careful fingers, I lifted the lid. Inside lay folded papers, fragile with age, and an envelope that bore my name in Ruth's looping cursive. The smell rose first paper that had absorbed decades of cedar and lavender. Then the words, "My dearest Lena," the letter began shaky but legible. "If you are reading this, it means I am no longer able to stand between you and the silence of this house. I cannot change what your parents value, but I can give you something of my own proof that you were never forgotten, and that your name belongs where others would erase it." My hands shook as I unfolded the next document. A trust declaration, typed, notarized, signed with a steady hand. The language was formal, precise, the kind Judge Klein would later praise to my granddaughter, Lena March. I set aside. The rest blurred as my eyes filled. Property funds terms of management. It was all there. It wasn't the money. It was the recognition. Ruth had carved out a space for me in ink, placed my name where no one else dared, fortified it with seals and signatures that no gala smile could overwrite. Zoom on the notary seal. The camera closes in closer still until the blue ink stamp fills the frame. Music cuts out. Only the dry rasp of paper between my fingers remains loud as thunder in its simplicity. I ran my thumb across the embossed circle, feeling the raised ridges press into my skin. That seal meant the document lived outside family myth. It existed in law and record in permanence. It was not a story Victor could spin or a silence Helena could hold. It was evidence, and evidence endured. I tucked the letter back into its envelope, tracing Ruth's handwriting with my fingertip. She had known. She must have seen the fractures forming, the way Victor tightened his grip on the March name, the way Bianca rehearsed her smile until it became armor. Ruth had known what was coming for me, and she had prepared the only weapon she could leave behind, a testament that refused to vanish. Judge Klein said nothing as I gathered the papers. She didn't need to. Her silence was not Helena's silence, strategic erasure. It was acknowledgement. A space left open for me to claim. I slipped the trust declaration into my notebook beside the birth certificate and the printout of Theo's wire transfer. The folder was growing thicker, heavier, as if each document added a new layer of spine to my back. I felt taller carrying it, not because of money or inheritance, but because of proof. That night, I wrote Ruth's words across the top of a fresh page you were never forgotten. Underneath, I wrote my name again. Lena March. This time, steadier, darker. The March family could laugh, erase silence, pay off exile. But Ruth had left me something stronger than apology. She had left me a record. And records once notarized do not vanish. I didn't sleep the night I found Ruth's trust. The papers sat on the desk beside my bed, their weight pressing against the silence of the room like they could tilt the air. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the notary seal the raised ink ridges etched against my thumb. It was real. Legal. But legality is only as strong as the person willing to test it, and I knew Victor would. So I went to the library. It wasn't glamorous, not the grand university library I once dreamed of studying in before law school vanished like a mirage, but a public branch with flickering fluorescent lights and carpets that smelled faintly of mildew. Still, it had what I needed: shelves lined with state law compilations, thick spines and dull colors, the kind of books most people ignored, but I treated like scripture. I borrowed what I could carry: probate law, trust law, property statutes. The circulation clerk gave me a look like she couldn't imagine why someone my age needed these, but she stamped them anyway. Back at Judge Klein's house, I spread them across my borrowed desk, their weight nearly buckling the cheap wood. I opened my notebook, the $5 spiral with my name carved into the first page, and began. Pencil in hand, I cross-referenced every clause in Ruth's trust against the state code. Paragraph by paragraph, I underlined annotated scribbled questions in the margins. Was the declaration properly witnessed? Yes. Notary presents signature legible seal embossed. Were there revocation clauses? None. Ruth had left no loophole, no conditional escape. Could Victor or Helena argue undue influence? Unlikely. The trust dated back years before my exile, drafted when Ruth was still sharp. Her attorney still active. Could Bianca claim equal inheritance? Not here. Ruth had been deliberate, specific, airtight. My pencil wore down to a stub. The eraser crumbled under pressure, leaving pink smudges across the pages. I didn't care. For every answer, I found my spine straightened a little more. It wasn't about the money. People always assume trusts are about wealth, about numbers with too many zeros. But for me, it was about recognition. Ruth had carved my name into law, immortalized it in a document that no amount of silence could erase. And now, with each statute I traced, I was learning how to defend that recognition. At one point, Miriam appeared in the doorway. She said nothing at first, just watched me with that hawk stillness of hers. Then after a long pause, she asked, "What are you looking for?" Gaps. I admitted, not glancing up. Weak spots they could exploit. And I tapped the clause I had circled twice. There aren't any. It's airtight. Her lips twitched, not a smile exactly, but something close. Good. Now remember, airtight doesn't mean they won't try to poke holes. It means you'll be ready when they do. I nodded, and for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't dared to claim: preparedness. The same kind of steadiness I used to imagine when I dreamed of standing in a courtroom case, files in hand, voice-clear arguments sharper than any insult my family could fling. When Miriam left, I sat alone with the mountain of books and let myself breathe. I traced the words again to my granddaughter, Lena March. The ink seemed darker now, fortified by my own notes, my own vigilance. The March family had power, money, and connections, but I had paper. I had pencil marks digging into margins. I had statutes highlighted in shaky lines. And most of all, I had a trust document with no revocation clause, no escape hatch, no erasure built into its bones. That night, as I slid the books into a neat stack, I realized what I had been doing all along. I wasn't just reading law, I was winding the clock, setting gears into place. Preparing for the moment the March family would try to strike, and ensuring that when they did, the mechanism would tick in my favor. Evidence waits, but law sharpens it into a blade. And I was ready to wield it. The invitation did not come as an olive branch. It came like a subpoena. A heavy cream envelope arrived at Judge Klein's house one afternoon, addressed in Bianca's flowing script that looked as if it belonged on gala menus or glossy magazine captions. Inside, folded neatly, was a note: family dinner. A chance to reconnect. To heal. The words were sweet, practiced a performance as obvious as stage lighting. But tucked behind it was the real purpose: a release form drafted by Corbett, the family lawyer. Its language was bloodless precise. For the sake of clarity, to simplify estate matters, to prevent future disputes, phrases that sounded administrative, harmless even. But the implication burned clear: sign this surrender, Ruth's trust, erase yourself formally and forever. I held the paper under the yellow lamp of Miriam's study, the edges trembling between my fingers. It wasn't the first time my family had tried to erase me, but it was the first time they wanted my consent to vanish. That detail, that audacity, almost made me laugh. I didn't laugh aloud, though. I simply wrote my reply on a card with a steady hand. Dinner accepted. I'll bring dessert. The night of the dinner, I arrived at the March house to find it unchanged, as if my absence had never occurred. The chandeliers still glittered too brightly, pretending to be starlight. The air carried its usual dual lemon polish from Helena's constant maintenance and the faint acrid sting of bread left too long in the oven. Image over substance always. The dining room looked exactly as I remembered, long mahogany tables set like a stage, crystal glasses that had never known dishwater silverware aligned with military precision. Yet it felt smaller now, shrunken by the knowledge I carried in my bag. Victor sat at the head spine, straight smile thin. Helena occupied her post beside him, hands folded neatly, her silence sharpened to a blade. Bianca was radiant as ever, her hair styled into effortless waves, her expression warm enough to melt cameras but cold underneath. "We're glad you came, Lena," she said first. Her tone rehearsed. "It's important that families resolve complications together." Complications. That was what I was to her. Not a sister. Not blood. A complication. Corbett, always the mouthpiece, cleared his throat and produced the release form. He slid it across the table toward me like a dealer placing a card, his fingers careful, his eyes avoiding mine. "This is standard," he said smoothly. "Purely administrative. If you sign tonight, we can put all unpleasantness behind us." I let the silence draw tight before answering. Then I unzipped my bag and set it on the table. "I did bring dessert," I said. Their faces flickered, confusion, irritation, the faintest crack in Bianca's composure. Slowly, deliberately, I opened the folder and began to lay out the papers. First, the notarized declaration of trust from Ruth. Then the photocopies of statutes highlighted in pencil. Then the handwritten notes, my margins marked with the care of someone who has studied survival as law. Each page slid across the polished wood with a faint rasp stacking like a second meal in front of them. I was never excluded from the record, I said, my voice calm even. "You only expected me to vanish." The chandelier light fractured against the glossy pages. Victor's jaw tightened. Helena's gaze flicked quick as a shadow, but she said nothing. Bianca's smile froze on her lips, stretched too wide as if she knew cameras might be watching even when there were none. Corbett shifted in his chair, tugging at his tie, already recalculating his arguments. I tapped the raised notary seal, its ridges catching the light. "This is airtight," I continued. "You know it. That's why you sent me this release form, because you hoped I'd erase myself for you. You wanted dessert served as my disappearance." I pushed the form back across the table toward Corbett, sliding it with 2 fingers. "I won't sign away my existence. Not for convenience. Not for clarity. Not for you." For a long moment, no one breathed. The silence was different this time. Not the silence of dismissal. The silence that once suffocated me as a child. This silence was recognition. The silence of realizing the narrative had shifted and they no longer controlled the script. I gathered the papers, slid them back into my folder, zipped my bag shut. Then I stood. "Dinner accepted," I repeated softly, almost kindly. "Dessert served." I left the room without waiting for a response. No one followed. No one dared. Outside, the night was sharp with cold. The stars were faint, but the air felt clean, as though the performance inside had finally broken. The March house glowed behind me, a theater lit for an audience that had already gone home. For once, I didn't feel like the girl cast out. I felt like the witness who had just entered her evidence into the record. Have you ever been asked to sign something just to simplify the problem? Comment 1 if yes, 0 if not. The morning after the dinner, I thought the silence might hold. That perhaps the weight of the trust documents, the notary seals, the words I had spoken across the polished table, would hang in the air long enough to slow them down. But the March family had never left room for silence when a story could be spun. By noon, the local paper had already hit the stands. I found a copy abandoned on the subway seat, its headline sharp enough to slice open the fragile calm I'd been carrying. "March family reconciliation, legal realignment ensures stability." The words coiled around me like smoke. Reconciliation, realignment, stability, all dressed up in quotation marks that never belonged to me. I read the article 3 times, each pass more surreal than the last. It painted a picture of a family bravely navigating internal complexities with graceful transparency. It described Victor March as steadfast in his commitment to community trust and Bianca as the radiant voice of unity. It even quoted Helena's silence, calling it dignified restraint. And me, I was there in ink but not in flesh. My name appeared twice stripped of context, dropped like Garnish daughter Lena March was included in the discussions, a united front was achieved. No photograph, no direct words, no acknowledgement of the folder I had set down of the trust declaration that proved my place. They had managed to stage a reconciliation dinner without me while I sat at the very table. The vocabulary was surgical. Reconciliation, a word that suggested forgiveness had been exchanged, that wounds had been sutured shut. Legal realignment, a phrase engineered to sound precise but vague enough to obscure the truth. It wasn't law. It was choreography language designed to smooth the edges of betrayal until they gleamed for public consumption. My stomach turned as I imagined the scene behind it. Corbett feeding lines to a reporter he had known for years. Bianca rehearsing her sound bites, practicing them in the mirror until they rang with sincerity. Victor nodding gravely, ensuring the tone was one of patriarchal sacrifice. Helena, of course, saying nothing, her silence again transmuted into strategy. And me, I was a ghost in my own story. Present in name, erased in presence. Judge Klein found me hunched over the paper at the kitchen table, my coffee cold. My jaw clenched. She glanced once, her eyes skimming the headline, then set the paper down with a dismissive flick. "This is how they play," she said. "Not with facts, with framing." "They made it look like I agreed," I whispered. My throat ached, like I signed. Miriam tilted her head. "Then don't waste your breath denying it in whispers. Put it in ink." Her words jolted me back to the notebook. My $5 spiral, its first page scarred with my name. I flipped to a fresh sheet and began to write not the family's version, but mine. Line by line, I recorded the dinner, the form pushed across the table the moment I laid out Ruth's trust. I wrote until the words no longer trembled, until my version felt heavier than the one on newsprint. I wasn't naive. I knew the public devoured image over truth, spectacle over statute. The March name had been polished for decades. Mine had been sanded down to splinters. But the trust was real. The letter from Ruth was real. And my records, those messy pencil marks in borrowed law books, were real. The PR piece would fade in a week, replaced by another gala announcement, another staged photograph of Bianca with donors. But my evidence would not. I folded the newspaper carefully, slid it into the same envelope that carried my birth certificate, Theo's payout printout, Ruth's trust. The file was getting thicker, heavier, impossible to ignore. They had written me out of the article. They had choreographed my silence into their unity. But the story wasn't theirs to direct anymore. Not while I still had ink. The envelope was waiting when I returned from the library, half hidden under the door like a shadow that had slipped inside ahead of me. Manila unmarked, folded at the edges from being carried too quickly. My name was scribbled across the front in a hurried hand. Inside a stack of documents. Not letters, not invitations, but financial records clipped together, loan agreements, property filings, transfer deeds. I scanned the header Monarch Family Trust. Not March, of course. They had been clever enough to dress the name in disguise to give it distance, plausible deniability. But even under the costume, I recognized the architecture. This was their work. A note was scrawled on the back of the cover page. "Saw this in a file. Thought you should know. E. Ethan. A friend from school who had drifted into the quiet world of banking. Not the kind of ally who shouts in your defense, but the kind who notices when numbers don't add up, when names appear where they shouldn't." I spread the documents across Judge Klein's desk, the lamplight bleaching the paper pale. At first, the records read like the usual legal jargon: asset reallocations, encumbrances, the language of shifting wealth from one box to another. But then my breath stopped. At the bottom of a deed transfer was a signature. My signature. Lena March. The sight made my skin crawl. My name curled neatly in dark ink across a line I had never seen before, attached to property I had never touched. For a split second, I doubted myself. Had I signed something years ago and forgotten? Had a form been slipped into a stack when I was too young to read the fine print? But then I looked closer. The L rose too clean, too controlled. My hand always looped wide, restless, as if it couldn't contain itself. The H at the end of March stood stiff when mine always slanted, weary and leaning. It was close enough to pass at a glance, but not to me. It wasn't me at all. It was him, my father, split screen. On one side, a letter Victor once scrawled his capital M broad and self-satisfied, the stroke heavy and deliberate. On the other side, the M on the deed. The same pressure in the downstroke, the same flourish curling too neatly into authority. My father's hand trying to wear my name. I stared until the letters blurred into black smudges. Rage rose slowly, heavy like water filling a room. This wasn't just exile anymore. This was identity theft, a hollowing out of my existence until even my name could be bent to their purpose. They hadn't simply erased me. They had started to use me. The implications rippled outward if they had forged me once. How many other times? What accounts bore my counterfeit name? What transfers slid through unnoticed while I was counting quarters at laundromats? How many times had Lena March been weaponized while the real Lena sat invisible? I gathered the papers with shaking hands, slid them into the thickening folder that already held my birth certificate, Ruth's trust, the wire transfer that had exiled Theo. Evidence number 3, the forgery. The folder was getting heavy enough to feel like armor. When I showed Judge Klein, she didn't gasp, didn't curse. She simply leaned forward, adjusted her glasses, and studied the signatures. "Sloppy," she murmured. "They always are when they think no one is watching." She tapped the 2MS with her finger, the split-screen comparison undeniable. "This isn't erasure anymore. This is theft. And theft is easier to prosecute." Her voice was calm, but it cut through me sharper than rage. I felt steadier hearing it, like the floor had stopped tilting beneath me. That night in my $5 notebook, I opened to a fresh page. At the top, in block letters, I wrote, "He signed as me." Beneath it, I copied the forged M, then my real one side by side. The page looked like a mirror warped in 2 directions. For the first time, I imagined what it would mean to step into a courtroom not as a ghost of the March name, not as a complication to be erased, but as a plaintiff. A woman with documents. A woman with proof. They thought they could forge me into silence. But all they had done was give me another piece of evidence. Have you ever seen your signature appear where you never put your pen? Comment 1 if yes, 0 if not. By the time the forged deed stopped trembling in my hands, I knew hiding was no longer an option. They had written as me, signed as me, staged me into silence, then weaponized the blank space where my voice should have been. I had been gathering evidence quietly. Birth certificate, trust declaration, Theo's payout, now forgery. But evidence left in a drawer is just paper. Evidence must speak. So I hired a lawyer. Not one of Victor's circle, not anyone who owed him favors at the club or donations at a gala. A young associate recommended by Miriam Klein, sharp-eyed and too new to be compromised. Her office was small, her suit off the rack, but when I slid the file across her desk, she handled it like it was gold. "They've been sloppy," she said, flipping through the forged deed. "Sloppy makes them dangerous, but also vulnerable. If you're ready to stop playing defense, we can move." Her words were a lifeline. For years, I had been the complication, the girl erased from photographs, the name crossed out at the bottom of forms. But now, for the first time, I had a chance to step out of their frame. The March family thrived on private control, whispered negotiations, press releases crafted behind velvet curtains. So I chose a different stage. Public, transparent, documented. I drafted a statement with my lawyer's help, every sentence weighed like evidence in court. No melodrama, no tabloid bait. Just fact sharpened into blade. They do not control me, only the silence they tried to build around me. I could have released it anywhere, but releasing it on my own channels would have felt like shouting into a void. Instead, I sent it to someone who understood the architecture of silence and how to break it, Priya Shah, the independent legal journalist. She ran a blog with no glossy ads, no corporate sponsorships, just relentless curiosity and a reputation for publishing what others buried. The email I sent was short evidence attached. Publish if you believe it matters. Her reply came within the hour. It matters. It will run tomorrow. When the statement went live, the contrast was immediate. Priya didn't dress it up in PR gloss. She placed my words in stark black text flanked by scanned images of the trust the notary seal and the side-by-side signatures mine and my father's. She wrote only one paragraph of introduction. When institutions try to erase individuals, the law becomes both weapon and shield. This is the story of one name that refused to vanish. The response was sharper than I expected. Lawyers in comment threads debated the trust language. Former clerks chimed in about notary practices. A retired judge emailed Priya to say the forgery alone could trigger a criminal probe. For the first time, the March machine wasn't the only voice in the room. Victor must have read it before his morning coffee. I imagined him at the head of the long dining table, the same table where I had once laid down Ruth's trust, his hand tightening on the paper, his jaw clenching. Helena, silent as always, her strategy cracking under the weight of exposure. Bianca fuming that her perfect smile couldn't rewrite a notarized seal. And me, I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I sat at Judge Klein's desk notebook open and copied the line I had written in the statement. They do not control me, only the silence they tried to build around me. Then I underlined it twice, pressing so hard the pencil broke. Control had been their currency. Silence had been their weapon. Now silence was mine to break, and control was no longer theirs to hold. I was not reconciled. I was not erased. I was on record. The mediation room looked nothing like a courtroom. No raised bench, no flags, no gallery. Just a rectangular table under fluorescent lights, a water pitcher in the center, plastic cups stacked like props no one would touch. The air was stale heavy with the smell of carpet glue and recycled air conditioning. I sat on one side, my lawyer beside me, her files neatly aligned. Across the table sat Victor, flanked by Bianca and Corbett. Helena, as always, sat silent, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some invisible horizon only she could see. The mediator, a weary man with wire-rimmed glasses, shuffled papers as though he wished he were somewhere else. The March family radiated confidence. Or perhaps it was habit. Victor's posture was straight-backed. Bianca's smile was sharpened for the cameras that weren't there, and Corbett tapped his pen like he was already drafting the press release. They had turned these rooms into stages for decades, but I hadn't come to play their script. When the mediator began with his rote introduction, I raised my hand. Before we proceed, I have a condition. Victor's eyes narrowed. Corbett frowned. The mediator looked up startled. My condition, I said evenly, is simple. If you want this mediation to continue, if you want any conversation entered into the record, you must first use my correct name. Aloud. On the record. The room stilled. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to dim. Victor shifted, his jaw tightening. For years, he had avoided saying my name, reducing me to she, to that girl, to silence itself. Speaking it aloud now would cost him more than any financial concession. Finally, he looked down at the papers in front of him as though the truth might be written there. His voice, when it came, was strained but clear. You are Lena March. He said each syllable deliberate. My daughter. One beat of silence. His face in close-up, the lines deepening around his mouth. The mediator's pen tapping faintly against the pad, the only sound in the room. I let the words hang in the air until they settled into the paper, into the carpet, into me. Then I nodded once. For the record, I said, turning to the mediator, please note that I accept no material settlement. I am here for one reason, only to ensure the truth enters the record. Corbett cleared his throat, his practiced composure cracking. Bianca shifted in her chair, her smile faltering. Helena's eyes flickered, but she stayed silent, her strategy crumbling in the face of something she couldn't polish away. Victor said nothing more. He couldn't. The act of naming me had already cost him. The mediator scribbled notes, his pen scratching across the pad, his expression caught between confusion and awe. Most clients came to mediation for numbers, clauses, concessions. I had come for recognition. For ink that couldn't be spun into PR gloss, for words that could not be cropped out of photographs. I leaned back in my chair, steady. "We can continue now," I said. But the truth was, I had already won. Not in the way courts tally victories, not in money or property. I had forced them, if only for one moment, to name me back into existence. That was all I had ever needed for the record to acknowledge me, for silence to be broken not by apology, but by accuracy. When we left the room, the water pitcher was still full, untouched like so much of the performance they tried to stage. But the record was not untouched anymore. It carried my name, and it would carry it forward. The night after mediation, I lit a match. The envelope they had once mailed me, the so-called release form, the document that demanded I sign myself into erasure, had sat folded at the bottom of my folder for months. I had kept it as proof, a reminder of what they tried to take. But now, with my name finally spoken on the record, it no longer felt like evidence. It felt like residue. I set it in a ceramic dish on Judge Klein's back porch, struck the match, and watched the paper curl inward. Flames licked the edges, the legalese dissolving into smoke. The release that once terrified me shrank into ash, its weight gone. The air smelled faintly of ink, burning a scent, bitter but cleansing. Then I turned to the photograph I had unearthed from Ruth's tin box. It was creased at the corners, the colors faded, but the image was intact. My grandmother and me, side by side, her arm looped around me like I mattered. I found a simple frame at the thrift store, plain wood, no ornamentation, and slid the photo inside. I set it on my desk above my notebook. Every time I looked at it, I remembered Ruth's letter, "You were never forgotten." Life didn't suddenly become cinematic after that. There were no headlines declaring victory, no parades. My father didn't crumble. Bianca didn't confess, Helena didn't weep. They carried on their performances as they always had, polishing their veneer for the next gala. The March family machine survived, but I survived differently. I returned to the work I had started quietly months before, helping at the rehab center on the edge of town. There was a girl there, Maya, just 11, recovering from a stroke that had stolen her left side and much of her speech. When I first met her, she wouldn't look me in the eye, ashamed of the halting sounds her mouth produced. But slowly, through exercises, patience, and shared silence, she began to claim her voice back. One afternoon, while guiding her hand through a tracing exercise, I felt the resonance of my own fight in hers. She pressed the pencil hard against the paper, stubborn, shaky, but determined. Watching her insist on her own letters reminded me of the night I wrote mine in a $5 notebook over and over, Lena March. The act of writing not as vanity, but as shield. I realized then that survival isn't only about proving yourself in front of those who want to erase you. It's about teaching yourself, and sometimes others, that silence is not the end of a story. Voiceover. If my life were a reel, I didn't win because they changed. I won because I did. Because I stopped waiting for reconciliation and started writing my own record. Because I understood that being named correctly is not a privilege, it's a birthright. Because every document I saved, every page I wrote, was proof that erasure is never final when ink survives. I keep Ruth's photo framed on the desk. I keep my notebook close, its pages scarred with my handwriting, my vows. And I keep showing up for Maya because helping her trace letters is as much a continuation of my story as any legal battle. In her stubborn pencil marks, I see the same defiance that once carried me out of a laundromat with $28 in my pocket and into a mediation room where my father was forced to speak my name. The March family can continue their theater. I have my record. Have you ever forced someone to say your name correctly just to close a chapter? Comment 1 if yes, 0 if not, and share your story below so that voices once cut out of the frame can return to their rightful place.